So it seemed that 95% of the world thought the iPhone 14 Pro Max was the best all-round smartphone camera of late last year. But new year, new releases, new challengers to the crown. We have the 200 megapixel monster Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra, the much hyped Vivo X90 Pro with its whopping 1-inch main camera Zeiss sensor, and there's a new flagship killer in town. How close can the OnePlus 11 get to these big hitters in over 10 key areas? They're all going head-to-head with the iPhone 14 Pro Max, starting with rear video. Now, while we must remember the OnePlus 11 is priced significantly less than the rest of them, so we wouldn't necessarily expect it to outperform the rest in many key areas, I must say I'm hugely impressed with just how close it got in many different departments, including stabilisation here. Front-facing video is another matter, as you'll see, but here we have all 4 shots in 4K 30 frames per second, and while the S20 Ultra and the 14 Pro Max are clearly in front, the OnePlus 11 and X90 Pro aren't too far away. Things do start to fall away on the bottom two when I begin to run, especially on the OnePlus 11. More on stabilisation in a second. Now, testing videos in really harsh direct sunlight was interesting, as firstly it flagged not only how the iPhone continues to struggle with lens flare, but also how much detail the OnePlus 11 was able to capture in the shadows, more so than any of the other three. Also, you will notice the colour temperatures of the OnePlus 11 and the 14 Pro Max are significantly warmer. There's a kind of reddish orangey hue that seems to be ever present in these two phones in certain lighting. I've often talked about the infamous iPhone tomato face, but the iPhone inconsistencies with colour continue here. The majority of times the iPhone, and to some extent on the Vivo X90 Pro with its new Zeiss Natural Colour 2.0, are more colour accurate than the other two, with the S23 Ultra and OnePlus 11 appearing at times a little oversaturated in comparison to real life. Although some would argue that those rich colours are more social media friendly, so you don't have to hunt around scrolling for filters. However, the iPhone and the OnePlus 11 aren't as authentic in other lighting situations when skin tones can become too red, whites are more creamy, and it's almost like the white balance is just a bit off. It's been like that for the last 3 or 4 iPhone and OnePlus releases, so there's nothing new there, and it's obviously something they're doing intentionally. I'm just not a massive fan. Now, HDR or high dynamic range is where the S23 Ultra really shines. The ability to preserve details in the shadows whilst also not overexposing or blowing out details in bright spots like the sun, etc., is nothing short of exceptional. The OnePlus 11 tends to prioritise shadows with often brighter all-round images, and the Vivo X90 Pro, especially in video, is often icy cool with prominent blues, but solid dynamic range similar to the iPhone 14 Pro Max. However, again, iPhone lens flare issue. But the S23 Ultra doesn't just stop there when it comes to improvements. With the new adaptive VDIS, which helps to analyse and subdivide movements and lighting conditions, along with the new OIS angle, which is now twice as wide as on the S22 Ultra, the stabilisation now not only competes with the iPhone 14 Pro Max, which was leagues clear at the back end of last year compared to any Android phone available, it might have now actually overtaken it. The bounce test and the 4K 60 FPS videos highlight this more than ever. Samsung and Apple are certainly leading the way, and by quite some distance, with the OnePlus 11 and Vivo X90 Pro falling short of the mark. Not poor, just noticeably not quite as good. But the biggest disappointment for these two phones is in front-facing video. Because again, not only is the stabilisation not as good, but we also only get a max of 1080p resolution as well, which is a bit of a shame, 4K on the other two. iPhone tomato face again. How no other reviewer seems to pick up on this, I will never know. And the iPhone also sometimes misses the mark with colour when it comes to the front-facing camera and selfies. Apologies for my attempt at this smouldering James Bond look. I would argue the iPhone produces brighter and often more eye-catching front photos, but it certainly doesn't usually make for the most authentic colour. A very often contrasty look, often overly warm, but I can admit that some of that is subjective, as seen clearly when I posted comparison photos over on my Twitter and Instagram. That's ASB_YT on both, and on TikTok if you want to follow those as well for behind the scenes and more shorter form content. And if you're enjoying this video so far, a like and a subscribe would be, it would make my day. Love you. The OnePlus 11 and Vivo X90 Pro can sometimes look a little artificial with the bokeh effect or background blur, but you can manually adjust the amount of blur, and actually the X90 Pro originally starts with 0 bokeh effect when you first load up portrait mode. Selfies on the OnePlus 11 can sometimes look like you've been sort of cut out of a picture and pasted onto a background. It sometimes doesn't look the most authentic, and the 14 Pro Max often has this very bright HDR look to it, as seen in my hair here. Now, I have a little bit of salt and pepper on the old Barnet, but I'm not that silver fox just yet. So again, the other three are more authentic in that department. And the S23 Ultra, in my opinion, handles edge detection the best out of all of them. It looks the most natural. Again, the iPhone here missing the mark. Both the Apple and Samsung devices produced the most sharpest details on the face, and that's even with beauty modes turned off. On the OnePlus and Vivo devices, they just look a little bit more smoothed, which again is not my personal preference. I like the details to be, nice and sharp. The S23 Ultra can often provide darker images than the other three, but nearly always maintains all of the image details. Portrait shots on the S23 Ultra just hit different. Less saturated, possibly more colour accurate and flatter, so if you did want to edit shots in post, you can do that. And again, HDR on the front-facing cameras across the board is pretty impressive, with my personal favourite of the four being the Vivo X90 Pro here. I think it did a really great job of not only keeping the details in the backgrounds, the lights for example, but also, like the iPhone, keeping that nice sharp facial image. S23 Ultra and OnePlus 11 not quite as good on this occasion. Side note, this probably isn't the most flattering angle for selfies, the things I do in the name of science for you. If we flip to rear portrait shots, they all can produce some brilliant images. All phones offer you a wider 1x style, but weirdly the S23 Ultra doesn't offer you a 2x and instead jumps straight to 3. The iPhone also offers a 3x, but also 1 and 2, with the OnePlus 11 and X90 Pro offering just the 1 and 2 options. I'm not necessarily saying I prefer the 1 and 2x to the 1 and 3x, but the fact that the iPhone offers 1, 2 and 3, then that is obviously the better option here. A lot of numbers, probably got your head spinning, as was Bonnie's head spinning while I was trying to take photos of her, and that brings up another difficult problem taking often portrait shots of moving subjects: motion blur. And although we have seen strides in a lot of smartphones in this area recently, they're still not pixel standard. What is it? The wife's just dropped off a McDonald's. That's incredible service. I promise you that isn't the norm. Can't remember the last time I had a Mackey's. The X90 Pro did seem to cope quite well in this department, and it also has a sports mode, which seems to increase the shutter speed, making movement shots more catchable. I did notice with regards to shutter lag, the S23 Ultra, whilst better than the S22 Ultra from last year, when the battery is low, it seems to perform quite significantly worse. I didn't do rigorous testing, just noticed it on the odd occasion. But when it hits, the S23 Ultra's photo details are just ridiculously good, as is the zoom. The S23 Ultra, with its dual 10 megapixel telephoto lenses, one 3x and one 10x optical zoom, and the max 100x zoom, is just head and shoulders ahead of the other three. The Vivo X90 Pro has an impressive range, being able to reach up to 40x to the lesser 20 on the OnePlus 11 and only 15 on the iPhone, but with only 2x optical on the 50 megapixel telephoto lens, the quality simply can't compete with Samsung. The OnePlus 11 also only has 2x optical zoom in its 32 megapixel telephoto lens, with the iPhone sitting just above with 3x. Now, I must say, while the S23 Ultra does slay the other three when it comes to the finer details when you zoom in and you look at bricks, text, hair strands, etc., around that 10x mark, there's less difference than I was actually expecting. Considering they're all using largely digital zoom at that point, very impressive how sharp they can be.
What?
Something that did surprise me when using the 4 camera apps was just how easy it was to scroll between the zoom ranges on the OnePlus 11 and on the Vivo X90 Pro. I was expecting it to be the other way around, but I actually found Samsung actually the most difficult to identify anywhere outside of the default ones on the side. If you're trying to scroll between and get a specific one that's not included, very difficult to actually pinpoint it. You glide past it, you scroll back. It's just, whereas the OnePlus 11 and the X90 Pro, just very easy. They just click really nicely through the ranges. Really impressive. But does it have great audio? Right, so next up we have an example of the front-facing video. We're going to shoot all of them in 30 frames per second, but the resolution is going to differ because the iPhone and the Samsung phone can go up to 4K. The Vivo and the OnePlus phones are only a max of 1080p. Again, we're looking at colours, we're looking at dynamic range behind me, audio, and all that goodness. Right, so this is the OnePlus 11. What do you think about this version? I'm just going to do a bit of mumbo jumbo talking so you can hear the audio and try and work out what you're seeing. And then we're going to jump to the Vivo X90 Pro. Again, 1080p here, which is a bit of a negative, especially for those looking to use the phone potentially for a bit of vlogging. Something else that can be used brilliantly for vlogging is having a form of kind of bokeh effect in the background, that nice blurred effect. And that's where these modes come in. This idea of having that blurred bokeh effect in the background that you would see on portrait photos. We can do it on video as well now on a lot of modern smartphones. Can't seem to find it on the X90 Pro. It might be me being an idiot, I don't know, but I can't use it because I can't find it. So even if it is there, that's a bit of a negative. Should be easier to find. If I had a personal preference for the three, I would possibly, looking at it from here, say the S23 Ultra. I need to check it in post, but let me know what you think, which of the three you would go for. They're all pretty impressive, I have to say, at giving you that sort of look. Who needs a DSLR anymore, right? As well as that type of mode, they all have a kind of action mode for that added stabilisation if you do need it. And Samsung have done an exceptional job with this, matching the iPhone's stabilisation, but also maintaining that 4K resolution. The iPhone 14 Pro Max drops down to 2.8K, and the other two are dropping to 1080p. So quite simply, it's another win for Samsung, as it is with 8K as well. The iPhone is the only one that can't deliver 8K, with even the OnePlus 11 and X90 Pro offering this support. I must admit, I would personally prefer 4K on the front camera and max 4K on the rear than 1080p on the front and up to 8K on the back. Again, I can appreciate that's personal preference, as is frame rate. The OnePlus 11 and X90 Pro are shooting in 24 frames per second, the S23 Ultra in 30 frames per second, and again, while I prefer 30 on this occasion, I can appreciate that for those cinematic lovers out there, the 24 frames per second might be your personal preference. But there's only one phone that delivers a jitter-free experience. These next examples will give you a great idea of colours, HDR and sharpness from that main sensor, which defaults to their lower megapixel modes. But of course, you have the ability to jump to higher resolution if you want to. The OnePlus 11 has a 50 megapixel one, as does the X90 Pro, with the iPhone on 48 megapixels and the S23 Ultra on that monster super hype train 200 megapixel mode. But does it make much of a difference? In certain situations, not really, because there's an air of a muchness about all four. That's not to say that any of them are bad and can all be used for that added information, for greater details, ideal if you want to select sections of photos as images in their own right. But what is perhaps more impressive is how all four of them adjust to low light situations. The improvements in phones for low light has been fairly substantial. The iPhones over the last couple of years have, on the whole, appeared slightly more natural in nighttime shots than its Android counterparts that have focused mainly on making the image just simply as bright as possible, and often doesn't really look like nighttime. It's just a bright sort of dusk image. But the shift is much more subtle now. All four phones definitely are looking for clarity and to reduce noise whilst keeping that true to nighttime feel. I must say how impressed I am with all four, even with the much cheaper OnePlus 11. It can produce some breathtaking nighttime photos, if a little inconsistent. The 14 Pro Max does struggle slightly with real bright spots, lights, neon signs, etc., and the mysterious lens flare phenomenon often creeps back in. There's no question my picks of the four are the S23 Ultra and the Vivo X90 Pro. The new adaptive pixel sensor on the S23 Ultra can combine 16 pixels into one larger pixel to more effectively utilise limited light for better performance. But this is where the 1-inch main camera Vivo X90 Pro really kicks into overdrive. The details this phone can produce in low light settings, especially in the shadows, is exceptional. It does all of this without looking overly artificial or overexposing bright spots like streetlights. Honestly, it really surprised me just how good this phone is. Nighttime shots might have a new champion. You even have a supermoon mode to get close to matching the S23 Ultra's space abilities, and these two phones certainly lead the way in the additional camera modes. There are fun options to play around with on the iPhone 14 Pros and on the OnePlus 11, but in sheer volume, the Vivo and Samsung phones take the win here. All phones have usable macro modes, not much to pick out between them other than the fact the iPhone seems to be able to shoot the closest to the object, and all phones have an ultra-wide angle lens, 12 megapixel on all apart from the OnePlus 11, which has a 48 megapixel version. The 14 Pro Max and the S23 Ultra are wider at 120 degrees, 115 for the OnePlus 11 and only 108 for the X90 Pro. Something to note, if you want to fit a lot of things into a specific shot, you might want to opt for the Samsung and Apple phones instead. And after many hours testing these phones, I think that's a wrap. As always, I'm only a mere mortal, and I admit some of that is personal preference. Let me know your personal preferences in the comment section below. Which would you go for out of the four and why? And if you enjoyed the video and found it helpful, drop a like, it means the world, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. I love you, Levy. I'll see you in the next one. It's ASBYT. Peace out.